So for the first question, I'll ask both of you, what's your name and what are you currently working on?
Thanks. My name's Dan Schafer. I'm a software engineer at Facebook, and I'm currently working on GraphQL, the technical preview that we just released, and then working on some internal work as well in order to make it a little bit more real-time.
My name is Nick Schrock. I'm also a software engineer at Facebook, and like Dan, I'm also working on GraphQL. I've been working on GraphQL for a while, and for the last about 6 months, been working on the open source release.
So GraphQL has a lot of excitement in the community. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what makes GraphQL differently and sort of the problem it's solving that hasn't been solved before.
I'll let you take this first.
Okay. No, we've really been overwhelmed with the community response, and what it does differently, and I think the most important thing about it is that we really started with the product experience, the product being GraphQL, meaning we tried to design what we thought was the ideal API for front-end developers and then work backwards to the technology. Rather than starting for a query language, something like SQL, starting from the relational DB and then moving forward to the client technology. And I think that is really why there's a lot of excitement because, as many people will point out, there's been systems similar to GraphQL that have effectively fulfilled the requirement of having a query language that client developers can use to query a backend, and they've never caught on, things like Sparkle or OData. And these are the type of things where the core idea of what they were doing was good, but it just didn't quite fit with the way client developers think. And, in a lot of things, the next big thing is doing the last big thing right. And we hope that this is true in the case of GraphQL.
I think you covered it.
GraphQL, because you're taking that sort of client approach and solving, which is a huge problem. There's been a shift more to client-side development, so we're building larger and more complex apps on the client side. So it's sort of a new scale of API usage in a lot of respects. What has been the most interesting discovery about how applications are built that sort of you've learned while working on GraphQL? Like what sort of new insights into how we go about building software?
Yeah, I think in the development of GraphQL, that was really, when Facebook was undergoing a shift from, this everything is server-side rendered model and our mobile application was just a wrapper around a web view. And we were trying to build out, a complex client application in order to power Newsfeed on iOS and Newsfeed on Android. And I think that's what we built GraphQL for, was powering this. And I think we sort of have refined over the last 3 years the way that sort of our components on the client side work. And I think the development of components, and I mean this both in terms of React components and a library that we released in iOS, that's clearly the path forward. And I think the approach that Relay uses in JavaScript and that we think is the right approach really in iOS or Android and any other client, of having each individual component not just be responsible for its display logic, not just be responsible for its view, but be responsible for what data it needs. And then in the same way that views can compose, those data needs can compose. I think that's the big development and sort of the big step function that we've seen in terms of client efficiency and developing, their components, developing their views and how they fetch data accordingly.
In terms of where GraphQL is now and sort of the state of front-end application development, what are the biggest remaining challenges to solve in this area?
Oh, where do I begin? The journey is far from complete. So with respect to the open source release, we think this is a big step forward, but effectively the open source release is where GraphQL was a year after we first shipped it. So, we're getting a lot of great questions from people in the community about, oh, when will we use this feature? When will we use that feature? Especially around streaming, for example, which there's a ton of interest in. And the answer is we're working on that internally, but just not in the state of the open source yet. But I really think the next challenge is that so many important apps are going to be messaging apps going forward. They're obviously really valuable. And reliability and performance in adverse networking environments are just extraordinarily important. And the current release of GraphQL is not particularly optimized for that use case. And that is really, I think, the next frontier of where we need to move to. So, we express GraphQL currently in terms of a client-server communication model. But what it really is, and what we really think of it as, is the product logic and the front-end abstraction that's used to describe the data requirements of views. But that can also talk to just something on a piece of software on the client. And it can be orthogonal to the client-server communication model, which can be streamy, which can be message-oriented. So I think bridging those gaps and making it so that message-oriented transports can be expressed in a language as natural as GraphQL and APIs as expressive as, say, Relay is really where we want to move over the next few years.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the shift where we're decoupling React from the DOM, where React is just the way of specifying how components interact, and then the DOM is just one way of sort of rendering this. I think we'll see the same shift with GraphQL. Right now, GraphQL is sort of the way you express your data needs, and also sort of it's directly connected to the server. GraphQL could easily just be a way of expressing data needs, and then how you actually get it from the server. GraphQL is like one way of doing so, but there are many others, and hopefully we'll see messaging apps will require something different.
So the scope of what you're dealing with is pretty massive, and you mentioned that this is the open source version and you're working on solving some of these problems internally. What does the future governance model look like for GraphQL in terms of what its open source release schedule will look like and how it'll sort of incorporate feedback from the community?
I think to be decided upon later. We haven't, honestly, I think the honest answer is that we've been so focused on producing the spec and so focused on producing the software that we haven't thought about that much. And the way I think about those kind of governance issues is that that is a problem you have to earn. Meaning, I'm actually not going to waste my brain thinking about that until we are confident that we're making a product and a system successful enough to have a governance model. That maybe wasn't the most artful dodge, but it is what it is. But it also happens to be true, so it's easy to remember.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you. I don't have all that much experience in the open source area, but fortunately, we get to work with people like Viju and the React team who, based on this conference, have done a pretty good job in building out a community, and so we'll almost certainly rely heavily on them in terms of like the right way to take a piece of software like this and build a community around it.
So then with the current version of GraphQL, what's up next? What's the next major open source release look like, and when might we sort of expect that?
I can do it. Yeah. So the next major release will be coupled with Relay. And what the next projects I think are fairly clear for us. One is we want to release a tool that we call Graphical, which is effectively an IDE-like environment for querying GraphQL servers and inspecting a type system and formulating the queries. It's actually a really natural and expressive way to explain the power of the system. Second of all, we want to have a working implementation that a client developer could use very directly to at least experiment with it, and that will likely be built on Parse. And then third, we are going to have to spec out some patterns in order to use Relay. So we have a notion that we call connections, and actually some very insightful people today were asking us, where's your connection model you were talking about? And we specifically did not spec it out in the core spec because it'd be like speccing out a best practice of C++ in the C++ spec. But we will have to create some specifications around that in order for Relay to be a broadly applicable system.
And then I think with the reference implementation in the spec that we released yesterday, we've already seen a ton of people interested on GitHub, asking questions and issues, creating pull requests. And so I imagine, as we're iterating on these things, we'll get really good feedback on, if there are aspects of the spec that are underspecified or overspecified or that we just didn't think about when we were releasing it. And that was one of the points of releasing it to the community, is to get that kind of feedback so we can iterate on that, before we get to sort of that next checkpoint.
I think after we've seen these pull requests, we should probably stick to computer science and not spelling. Yes.
All right. So a final question for both of you. What do you see in the future of GraphQL, say 2 years out?
I'll let you go first so I can think for a second.
I don't know what the future will be, but I think what we want to see is projects both large and small using the system. And what I would really like to see is that it's a very complicated system. If you read the specification, there's a lot of features you need to implement, and but we bias on incurring that complexity on a small set of developers who have to develop the runtimes and the core tools. Where I would really like to see in, say, 2 years is it's kind of a de facto standard for building new backends for these client applications, and it is not particularly difficult to do so. And then having an ecosystem of tons of different client code and servers with extremely high quality tools. And maybe in the future, the really having it become a lingua franca for data interchange on the web as a whole. Because if you can imagine, across internet companies, because if you imagine if you can just point our graphical tool at a backend that you're interfacing with, say across an organization that you have access to, you can immediately start being productive, exploring what they're providing you, and building kind of mashups like you used to back in the day. Kind of bring back the late 90s.
Yeah, I think the vision for me is, we have GraphQL, we have Relay, we have things like React and React Native, and I think we're just going to see a massive step function in terms of developer productivity. It's something that we've observed using GraphQL internally, where we can just move faster because of these tools that we have available. And I think GraphQL plays an important role in that ecosystem that we're starting to see adopted, and hopefully will continue to be adopted. And so I envision hopefully if someone who's starting something from scratch in 2 years is looking at these technologies and saying, all right, I need to build an iPhone app, an Android app, and a web app, and I'm going to quickly build my server in GraphQL, picking up one of these core systems in the language of my choice, and I'm going to use Relay and React Native, and you just have a web app and these apps, and it's easy to build, and you're just moving faster and building better things easier than you were before.
All right. Thanks a lot. That was very helpful and informative.